Nigeria is Africa's largest producer of oil and natural gas, yet its electricity woes have become proverbial. More than half of the country's 200 million population has no access to constant power supply. It is almost impossible to discuss the growth potential of the Nigerian economy without recourse to the challenges in the power sector. There have been efforts by government and other stakeholders in the sector to address these challenges and get the sector running optimally, but all to no avail. Joining me in the studio to give answers to this is the Lagos State Commissioner for Energy and Natural Resources, Olalere Odusote. It's good to have you with us.
Well, thank you.
All right. So, you've heard the intro, and what do you make of that development? It's always a lingering problem when it comes to the Nigerian power sector, as it were. We're still going to link it to Lagos State. So, how would you describe the synergy between the Nigerian federal government, the federal power grid, and of course the Lagos State power project as well?
Let me start by, first of all, trying to describe the power sector.
Right,
it's a value chain that starts from the fuel side of things, which is the natural gas, like you rightly mentioned, which is really the prevalent form of generation that we have in Nigeria today, besides the hydros that we have, and some few attempts at solars that we have, which make up a very minor segment. From the generation part of it, you've got the transmission sector, which is still today controlled by the federal government, and then you have the distribution sector. The distribution sector is where the tar hits the tar. That's really where people get to see the electricity sector, and that's where they get to see the electricity and the energy come into their homes, and that's where they get to pay for it. Now, what happened in the Nigerian power sector was there was a privatization. The distribution companies were sold to private players who were then supposed to make it work. What would have happened had the distribution sector worked well is they would have been able to afford to pay for the transmission and the generation that they received. As it were, that never happened because while the distribution companies were sold, the distribution companies were never left alone to manage their own affairs. They were stuck with fixed tariffs because somebody had to then come back and say, I'm going to control the tariffs that you charge, which then affects their economics. Because if you don't earn enough money, you can't invest in infrastructure. If you can't invest in infrastructure, you can't improve the services to the people. And that's what's happened. So we're stuck in a situation where we're trying to move ahead, but then again, we're being held back because someone has decided that I'm going to fix the tariffs that you pay. That, in a large part, is the biggest part of the problem. What has since happened is there's a small market has grown of off-grid players who are then selling power to their customers at a price that makes economic recoverable sense, and they're growing. There's the solar off-grid space today that's going in leaps and bounds. There's a lot of work that's been done by the REA to promote off-grid solutions, and that seems to be working. So we have to find our way to get that into the mainstream, to start trying to get the businesses to be viable based on what it is they can do, rather than what someone is forcing them to adhere to. There's nothing wrong with regulation, but the regulation has to be, it has to be progressive. Meaning we have to be able to look at what it is that you say you can't charge for what you can deliver and allow you to charge them and not allow you to over-recover. If we can do that, then we'll have the beginnings of an improvement in the sector.
Very good. You mentioned the word we're being held back. And when you take a look at it, you talked about transmission, distribution, generation. You can't help but think there's a lot of bureaucracy involved in all of this. So what will it take for 21st century Lagos to be fully self-sufficient in power generation distribution, independent of the national grid at this rate?
So we've looked at a few things. The 21st century Lagos certainly needs constant, reliable supply of energy.
And the market is there? A huge population?
So
constant demand.
Let me try and address that question a different way. When you say the market is there, why do you think the market is there? So if you look at the estimates and statistics that we have, some will tell you that we have 3 times as much self-generation capacity as we have grid capacity. That's been paid for, meaning every time I get to my house, if I switch on the light and nothing happens, I have to go to the back of the house and go and make a lot of noise, and then come back in the house and switch on the light for it to happen.
Indeed.
So I'm paying for it. If I'm paying for it, why can't I pay that money to the grid?
True.
If I'm paying for my diesel generator, my petrol generator, why can't I take some of that money and pay it to the grid and then get the energy that I require? It's going to take some time, even after we liberalize the sector. It will still take some time for the investments that's required in the sector to be able to provide the succor that we want. But we have to start at some point. And in Lagos, what we're doing is we're taking the grid. We're going to look at the grid in segments. We're going to be improving the grids in segments. And we're going to be making sure that we talk to the people in the areas that we've decided to take over and let them understand that they have to pay cost recoverable tariffs and then give them the assurance of 24 hours electricity supply. So that's what we're looking at doing. And if we can start to do that in a few pilot areas, starting in 2020, we'll be able to open up the market in Lagos to private sector people to partner with us in the state government and the existing distribution companies to ensure that there's 24-hour power in Lagos. We think that that can happen sooner than later. And we'll wait for regulation to catch up with us.
All right. There's the Lagos Light Up project. I remember not too long ago. What are your thoughts on that? What's the update on that?
All right, so it's interesting that you mentioned that. Light up Lagos means a lot of things to a lot of people. For some people, it's light up the common areas, i.e. make sure that the street lights are working. For other people, it means going to build power plants in different parts of Lagos to ensure that there's power generation within Lagos. The problem, right, with that idea is that our problem in Nigeria today is not generation. I had a meeting with the managing director of the Niger Delta Power Holding Company just yesterday, who said to me that he has 4.5 gigawatts of generation capacity, of which he's only dispatching about 700 megawatts. So he's got, what, 3.8 gigawatts of electricity just sitting idle, waiting for the market to open up for him to be able to supply. And he has lots of constraints. Some of them, he said, are transmission constraints, which is investment that we need to make. Some of them, he says, are gas constraints, which mean... And the issue with gas constraints is we say that there's no gas. Nigeria has plenty of gas, but the gas isn't being paid for. If we're able to pay cost recoverable prices for gas to the producers, they will be encouraged to produce for our markets. But it starts at the end again. If the price of electricity is fixed at a level that cannot pay for all the components, then we're going to continue to have shortages.
Indeed. Now let's talk about the issue of alternative source of energy. We've talked about the conventional ones, hydropower, gas, as you mentioned as well. There's wind and solar options, including ocean waves, which has recently been developed. So, these are all abundant around Lagos State. So, are there any plans to tap into all that
Yes, there
sources?
is. I mean, and I will be telling if I revealed. So I will give you some hints of what we're doing. Lagos State is about to sign an MOU with an international partner to carry out wind studies in Lagos over the next 1 year. The intention is for us to know where we can generate wind power in Lagos. I expect that in a year from now, we will have the answers from that study and we'll be able to decide whether wind is the way to go or not. Nigeria is a gas basin. We have a lot of natural gas and we can generate from natural gas. We just have to be able to pay for it. Now, wind is not free either. So even if we decided to generate from wind, we'd still have to get the tariffs to a level that it can sustain the generation that we require.
Still talking about sustenance, what about bio waste options here? You can talk about, there's so many refuse heaps all over Lagos, you can actually compost them and, countries like Brazil have been able to make a success out of bio waste. So to generate electricity.
I'm going to say two things. Number one, our problem is not generation. I'll say that again. That said, we do have the waste. I am currently on my table, I have about 23 proposals, right, on waste to energy generation. We're reviewing all of them, and as they make sense, we will start to execute on them.
So what all the challenges are in the power sector regarding, you executing your set policies, as it were?
So for us in Lagos, it's not a very big problem. We've come up with our own regulations that will help us intervene in the sector. And I will say watch the space.
All right, very good. So talking about internally generated revenue and the use of state's natural resources, how has Lagos been able to fare so recently?
It's very simple. So interestingly, I was in Abuja yesterday. I was with Mr. Governor of Lagos State at the NEC conference, and one of the things that was discussed under the chairmanship of the vice president, and one of the things we talked about was the participation of the state governments in the mineral sector. So we've got solid minerals in Lagos State. We've got sand for the most part, silica, clay, etc., that we intend to start to work with the federal government on. And one of the things that was discussed was the need for the federal government, which has the exclusive jurisdiction on mineral resources, exploitation today, according to the Constitution. We talked about the need for the states to partner with the federal government in this. And the federal government is actually quite keen, because today there's a lot of conflict. The state by virtue of the land law, have jurisdiction over land, and the federal government has jurisdiction over the mineral resources. Now, where do you separate the two of them? Is it the land or what's under it that we're talking about? So we're talking about working together, and there's a committee that's in every state government. The Federal Minister of Mines still has set up 6 regional offices in the 6 geopolitical areas of Nigeria to enable the interaction within the states and come up with workable solutions for us to work together.
All right. Now, where does legislation come in when you have situations like that, the dichotomy between who is supposed to be have control of the land and the resources, as it were?
So there are 2 ways to do it.
All right.
One, you can either go to the courts to test it, or you can sit down and come up with a solution that works for both of you without having recourse to the courts, and then come up with agreements between the 2 agencies, and then come up with a work program that you can execute.
All right. So what's your outlook for your portfolio in terms of energy and mineral resources, as it were, for 2020?
There's a whole bunch of things we're looking at, from improving the emissions in Lagos. We're in discussions with some
that's
partners.
even a very interesting development there.
So Lagos is among the major cities in the world, has the highest per capita death toll from pollution.
All right.
So one of the things we're looking at is starting to reduce the bus emissions in Lagos. We're considering legislation that will stop diesel buses from coming into Lagos and replacing them with natural gas in the first instance, and then a few years down the line starting to look at electricity buses. So we're going to be carrying out a pilot program next year where we're going to be converting some of the transport buses in Lagos from diesel to run on natural gas, of which we have abundant resources. And the plan is to have tariffs that are cost recoverable, so we will not be hobbled by the inability to support the gas fuels that we need.
That's an interesting development there. All right, Mr. Olalere Odusote, Commissioner for Energy and Mineral Resources, Lagos State. It's good to have you with us.
Well, thank you. It was certainly good to be here.
All right.